Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to another great episode of Israel Unplugged. This is where you get the unadulterated facts of where we're holding in the redemptive process, focusing primarily on the ingathering of the exiles. This is Josh Wander from Yerushalayim, Yer Kodesh, and I'm here with my co-host, Rabbi Moshe Lichtman from Beit Shemesh.
Shalom, shalom. It's good to be back, and it's good to be healthy. Last week I wasn't feeling well. Thank God we're back, and we have a great show planned for you today.
We indeed have a great show. We have a wonderful guest coming up. His name is Rabbi Ari Kahn. And if you haven't heard of him, he's a very, very special person. He is an author and an educator, and he lives in Givat Zev, where he serves as the rabbi of the Mishkan Etrog community. He received his rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University's Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary, where he studied with Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik and Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. He graduated Yeshiva University with a BA in psychology and an MS degree in Talmud. He is the director of the Overseas Students Program at Bar Ilan University, where he is a senior lecturer in Jewish studies. His most recent book, his 12th, is called The Crowns on the Letters. Now, it's fascinating to me when I have guests on. Often, they want to know the subject, the topic that we've chosen for the interview. And I gave him a list of topics, and most people were like, oh, this is the one that I'm familiar with. He said we could do it all. He knows them all. So we're going to have a good time going through them. He's a prolific writer, so I encourage you to read his books. And again, I want to mention before I forget that Rabbi Lichtman also has his own site, which is toratzion.org. .com, sorry. And we have our israeltorah.org, and we also have on YouTube Israel Torah, YouTube/Israel Torah. We encourage everybody to go there, watch the videos, subscribe, give them likes, and help us spread the news to everyone. So be right back. Hold on. After the news, we're going to have Rabbi Ari Kahn, and we're going to have an amazing discussion about Eretz Yisrael today and why you should be here.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Thank you for staying with us. Just to remind everyone that this is a live show, so you can call in with your questions or your comments. If you're in North America, the number is 301-768-4841. And if you're lucky enough to be in Eretz Yisrael, then the number is 02-650-0151. As promised, we have a guest, Rabbi Ari Kahn, on the air. I'd like to start off by an icebreaker over here. I was speaking to someone the other day, and he mentioned to me a very interesting point. He said that the more Tanakh that one learns, the more Zionist you are. And there are some communities that actually shunned the learning of Tanakh because, specifically Hungarians, because they were anti-Zionist and they didn't. What are your thoughts about that? The more Tanakh you learn, the more Zionist you become.
I agree with that completely. And I'm thinking back to when we actually did have in high school a Tanakh class. It became completely separated from any reality that had to do with Israel, and it just became somehow swimming back into the Gemara and understanding things from the Gemara rather than understanding Tanakh. But I think it's true. But to be completely fair, there's also a Rashi that people quote in Masechet Brachot that speaks about, at least which is interpreted as understanding that one should stay away from learning Tanakh, at least Tanakh by itself, without other things, because it could be misunderstood.
Without learning it with Rashi.
Then
it was a plug for his newest sefer.
I accept the point completely, and I think the opposite is true. The more that one goes into it and studies it, I think the more love of Israel one would have.
Right. Beautiful. They're probably saying that you shouldn't neglect your study of halacha and Mishnah and Gemara, and only spend all your day learning Tanakh. That I think we would agree with.
Right. That Rashi, which is quoted, is on the Gemara that says that himana atzmo min higayon, which is understood by some people as the study of Tanakh. The word is higayon, which should be logic or philosophy, but I'm saying it's very interesting that interpretation snuck in somehow.
I gave you a list, Rabbi Kahn, of subjects that we could discuss, and those included the Geula, the redemption, Kibbutz Galios, the ingathering of the exiles, Mashiach ben Yosef and David, Yemos Mashiach, the times of the Mashiach, as well as discussing the halachic imperative for Aliyah today. You said you were prepared to speak on any of those topics. What would you like to start with?
What would I like? Asking me.
Yeah, let me just jump in here. Maybe you can connect it. Maybe you can connect it to the beginning of the parsha. The fact that this is the beginning of Galut, of the first Galut of Am Yisrael in Egypt, and and the beginning of the Geula from Egypt. Maybe we can learn some lessons from that to today's day and age.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think if one really pays attention properly, you'll come to the realization the last third of Bereshit was actually dealing with who's going to be the eventual Melech. Probably the most important pasuk, I'm saying, to focus us, is when it says, and here were the kings in Edom before there was a king in Israel, which telling you that a king in Israel is actually the issue. And that's Yosef's dreams, and that's Yehuda's eventual victory, which means the whole issue is about who's going to be king, which is almost them telling us before we go into Galut, we still need to be able to know we're coming out of this. And when we come out of this, not just are we going to survive, but we're going to thrive, we're going to go into our country, and we're going to have a government over here. We're going to have a monarchy, we're going to have a government, we're going to create a whole new different type of life. And that's what's interesting, is that all of that to be resolved before we can start Sefer Shemot.
Wow. Very, very insightful. I never thought of it that way.
So, what does this mean for us today? What is the halachic imperative to make Aliyah? What has changed in our generation from previous generations?
When we were in yeshiva, I'm thinking about Moshe and I, Rabbi Lichtman, I should say, when we were in yeshiva together years and years ago. We would learn these sugyot, and we would really trouble ourselves to understand it. And why doesn't everybody understand what it says? Look, the reality is that people are going to come because they believe something beyond halacha. They believe that this is where they should be. The people who don't come is because they have other reasons. I don't believe if one more rabbi gets up and says, yeah, obviously in terms of halacha today, one should be here. It's interesting. People go into so much into the Rambam and Sefer Mitzvot. Did he include it? Does he not include it? The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah tells you that you're not allowed to leave Israel. I mean, why would it be that you can't leave unless you're supposed to be here? I think it's really quite clear that in terms of, you mentioned Tanakh before. Any Jew has understanding of Tanakh would understand that at least it's preferable. Now, you want to play a game, and I'm sorry for using that term. The counting of the Taryag Mitzvot and how you count them is something which is really important on an academic level. But in terms of how Jews live their lives, can anybody question the centrality of Israel in terms of Jewish history, in terms of Judaism, in terms of Tanakh? I don't even understand how the question can arise.
And yet, many Orthodox Jews around, including rabbis, around the world, they don't seem to. I was just speaking to somebody today I was explaining that in the yeshiva world in America today, it's not that they're against Zionism. It's not that they speak that they suggest that it's better to be in America. They just ignore it. It's something that's not spoken about. It's something that's not. So my question, I guess, more is, what are we lacking? What are we missing? Or what are they missing in their educational system where they're not teaching people about, like you said, the centrality of Eretz Israel?
I think that people look at Judaism as a Reshut HaYachid instead of a Reshut HaRabim, which means the challenge of Israel, and it is a challenge, and maybe they focus on all the difficulty, the challenge of creating a country where we have lots and lots of neighbors who are not observant, or at least observant in terms of complete observance, is a challenge, okay, but have we ever walked away from challenges? Which means the opportunity of living in Israel is creating a Judaism which is Reshut HaRabim. Let me give you one example, which I always find someplace between tragic to comical. You get to Parshat Shoftim, and how many Divrei Torah are you going to hear that, Shoftim v'Shotrim, it means your eyes and your ears and your nose and your so on, and I'm not belittling the Dvar Torah, but it's not Pshat. Pshat is Shoftim v'Shotrim. We need judges. We need, if Shotrim in fact means police, we need to create a collective. We need to create a Judaism which addresses a Reshut HaRabim. And therefore, this inability to understand even what the words say and to satisfy oneself with the Dvar Torah, saying, it means these other things in terms of stimulus or stimuli and where you look at and so on, that's a very nice idea, but it has nothing in the world to do with what the psukim actually mean. I mean, there's actually a mitzvah of learning Torah also. So I can ask you, so how could somebody settle for something which is so far from Pshat? It's that essentially they have inherited this previous concept of Judaism, which was forced to be in a Reshut HaYachid, and what they've done is essentially they've said, Minhag Avotenu b'yadeinu, and never occurred to them that we should be striving to do something more.
I dare say that there are rabbis in Chutz La'aretz that get up on Parshat Lech Lecha and don't mention Eretz Israel. They speak about Lech Lecha being some sort of existential question, and they don't mention the land because that's something that they seem to have missed or choose to ignore.
Right. What I think you're saying is that the focus turned when we went into the exile. The focus turned to the religion of Judaism, and they forgot about the fact that we're a nation. The nationhood of the Jewish people which is part of the religion, and that's the funny thing. There are so many mitzvot that depends on, like you said, appointing a king. That is a mitzvah in the Torah. It's part of our religion, but, it was not part of our religion in the galut, in the exile, and therefore they just, forgot about it. And they're having a hard time getting back into it.
I think that the whole history of Zionism has a lot to do with it, but they see Zionism as something which is not religious. It's not frum. It's not something which is who they should be. And then there'll be a hyper-focus on negativity. I've pointed out on occasion to people, to students, people who will listen, that whatever you're going to say about the government today, including Ben Gurion, we had malachim in Israel who were far worse than them in every single way. And they had a din of melech in Israel. If you look at the Rambam in the laws of Hanukkah very carefully at the beginning, when he describes what Hanukkah is about, he says something which is amazing. He says that at the end, the Malchut Hashmonai, and again, keep in mind, the Rambam knows everything the Ramban knows. The Ramban, Nachmanides, attacked the Hashmonaim for holding on to the kingship. That was in this last week's parsha. That Yehud is the one who should have the king, and the Hashmonaim, who were Kohanim, they held on to the kingship. And the Ramban attacks them terribly for doing this. And he quotes the Gemara that says, at the end of the day, anybody who says he's from the family of Hashmonaim is a slave. The Rambam knows all those sources, and nonetheless says, when he tells the story of Hanukkah, he says that we celebrate. Why? Because the kingdom, the Malchut, returned to Israel for 250 years, which means the Rambam there is telling us that what Hanukkah ultimately is not just a Nes Pach Shemin and not just a military victory that happened on one day. It is the result of that victory that we had Jewish sovereignty for 250 years, and therefore sovereignty is something to be celebrated.
100%. So we're going to have to go to a break. So we're going to continue this very interesting conversation right after the break. Please stay with us, and we'll be right back.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Okay, welcome back to Israel Unplugged. We are in the middle of a very interesting conversation with Rabbi Ari Kahn, the author of many books. We gave an introduction before he came on about all the books that he's written. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit. But I wanted to ask, because one of the things in this introduction we mentioned was that he had the privilege of studying by two great rabbis of the last generation. One was Rav Yasher Ber Soloveitchik, better known as the Rav, the basic leader of modern Orthodox Judaism, and his son-in-law, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who started the yeshiva in Gush Etzion, Yeshivat Har Etzion. And I wanted to ask you, Rav Ari, can you tell us something about their Zionism? We know that the Rav wrote probably one of the most beautiful expressions of Zionism, the Kol Dodi Dofek, or he said it. So he didn't really write it. He said it as a drasha, and but what was your impression of his Zionism, and also Rav Aaron Lichtenstein? Did he talk about it? Did he encourage boys to make Aliyah, etc.?
So Rav Soloveitchik, who I knew, which was, I had first heard him speak personally in the late 70s, and I learned with him in the early 80s. He did not speak about it all that much. I think that the world would have been very different had he made Aliyah when he had first wanted to in 1935. And he ended up being a Zionist in every sense of the term, but he was still a brisker. So he was very concerned about bigger issues. For example, he had once said that the history of Judaism may depend on the first 50 years of the State of Israel, because people will equate Judaism with Zionism and Judaism with being Israeli, and therefore the type of a culture which is created may actually, for most of the world, create in their minds what Judaism is, which means he understood absolutely the Judaism in Israel, and therefore the flip side of that is today, that if somebody is anti-Israel, they're really anti-Semitic. He understood that, but he saw the great responsibility of the State of Israel, and it scared him. I spoke to him one point about something completely unrelated, and this is a private conversation, and he took it into a discussion about what happened in Lebanon, in Sabra and Shatila, and he was torn about, not because Israel did anything, but because of the perception and the responsibility, and he was very strong on that, which means he saw things on a much larger level than I think most people did. But Rav Lichtenstein, on the other hand, sacrificed a great deal to come to Israel. I mean, he was I don't know how to put it if you want, he was the crown prince. He was the one who should have inherited that mantle in America from Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he was very qualified to have been the leading rabbi in America in every single possible way. And he, in a certain sense, sacrificed that career to become something else, but what he became, I think, ended up being far greater in terms of the impact that he has had in Israel.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember again,
like a child?
Yeah.
His parents spoke to him in Hebrew. He was raised speaking Hebrew because of that kind of feeling towards Israel. Hebrew was his first language, even though he spoke a bunch of other languages. But that's what they spoke at home. That's what he spoke. I remember him speaking to his parents. He spoke to his parents only in Hebrew.
Wow, I didn't know that. His father was from where? Wasn't he from France? I think. Or am I getting that wrong?
I'm not sure if his father was originally from France, but his father was educated in France.
Mm-hmm.
His father actually met his mother in Switzerland.
Maybe that's what it was. I knew it was somewhere in Europe. I just recently, I'm working on a book, and he quoted the early opponents of Zionism, and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik and the whole Soloveitchik family, basically. I mean, like you said, the Briskers are vehemently anti-Zionist. So, if you talk about what Rav Soloveitchik did, what it meant to him personally, the cost that it cost him, so to say, of going against the family, was probably a very, very, very big price that he had to pay, but he really believed in it. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. I think as late as 1940, I'm not sure how much further, he was the vice president of the Aguda in America. And after the Holocaust, he walked away from the Aguda, and he felt they had failed Jewry in terms of Europe, and they did too little, and that there was a huge historical mistake, which, by the way, goes back to the same point that I made earlier. He saw things in a very, very big way. And by the way, on both occasions he said, we need to add another al-Chet. He said, we need to add an al-Chet, that we ignored our brother's cry in Europe, and we didn't answer. And he also felt we needed a al-Chet because of the blood on our hands by extension in terms of things that took place by the Israeli army not being on top of things. So I'm just saying that was interesting. But going back to your point specifically, he became the head of Mizrahi, and that was probably more than anything else his biggest sin in terms of the quote-unquote yeshiva world.
I think it's fascinating because this actually goes back to what we were discussing earlier, and the fact that Zionism is ignored by many of the Orthodox communities in America today, and perhaps the reason is not because they're anti, but more so because they're afraid to deal with such big issues. I've heard this a number of times, that there are prominent rabbanim that are just afraid to deal. The issues are just so large, and it's not in the Chalakim of Shulchan Aruch that you can find these answers. So what they were familiar with in exile for thousands of years, and just opening up a Shulchan Aruch to try to find out what we should do, or a Gemara, that you can't do when it comes to these national decisions. And that perhaps is why the Aguda and other religious parties here in Israel for many years had a policy of not having sarim, not having ministers in the government, because they didn't know how to control, how to paskin these kind of halachic shilas.
Yeah, I remember years ago I got a question from Lebanon. Somebody called me up, an officer called me up and said, we have no supplies, and we want to go into a Hezbollah-owned supermarket and take supplies. And there's an argument among the soldiers whether we should leave money or not.
Wow.
Okay, so now how do you pass on such a question? But I can tell you what I answered him. Part of the answer was very practical, but I said to him, check with your commanding officers if you have permission to go in or not. Because when it comes to kibush, there's no such thing as a kibush of a yachid. The kibush is from a tzibur, which means anything that the tzibur captures belongs to the tzibur, not to an individual. So if you get direct orders from your commanding officer that you have a right to take these things, so then you have a right to use them. Otherwise, they don't belong to you or your soldiers, and therefore they may be very well correct about leaving money. Of course, the fear of leaving money is that Hezbollah, that when they come back, they use it to buy more bullets or bombs or so on. But I'm saying, how do you deal with such questions without any real, history of psak in these things?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Definitely. Okay. I understand that you have to go to Mincha. You have to leave us, or
I'm starting to walk down. I'm taking you with me.
Oh, you're starting to walk. Okay, so Josh, you have one last question, maybe?
So yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your take as Mashiach ben Yosef. We're talking about the parashas. Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. In a nutshell.
My take of Mashiach ben Yosef in the next minute or so.
Right.
The prototype of Mashiach ben Yosef is obviously Yosef. The additional prototype is Yeshua. And Yehoshua is the one who fights against Amalek. The reason that Yosef or Yeshua has the ability to defeat Amalek is, I think, primarily starting point on a moral level. Amalek inherited the hatred of Esav towards Yaakov. And hatred was based upon that Yaakov was the one who took away the Bechorah, even though Esav sold it to him. And Esav had, shall we say, seller's remorse. He was quite upset. So therefore, essentially, Esav is walking around with all of his hatred, and his son, grandson, great-grandson, they inherited. But Yosef could say to Esav, your brother did terrible things to you? I mean, you hated the Bechorah. The Yiv is Esav, it's a Bechorah. My brothers try to kill me. My brothers sold me. And how does Yosef take revenge on them? He gives them food for all the years. He takes care of them. Now, the brothers never understood Yosef. That's part of the secret of Mashiach ben Yosef. It's somebody who has this incredible moral stature. It's somebody who takes care of Klal Yisrael. And it's somebody who Klal Yisrael are going to completely misunderstand, because ultimately Yosef is a very hidden individual. Tzafnat Paneach. So the Vilna Gaon famously said that anybody who's involved in the building of Yerushalayim, of Zion, because Zion and Yosef and Gematria are the same, is it has a spark of Mashiach ben Yosef within him. So I guess 120 seconds or so, that's an introduction.
No, I was just going to ask, what do you think? Good. What Mashiach ben Yosef, is it a person or is it a process?
The simple understanding is that it's a person, but the big chiddush that the Gra left with his students was that many people can have a spark of that, within their neshama. It's the way that souls work. It works with sparks as well, not just in absolute terms.
Right. But there still will be one person who will be known as Mashiach ben Yosef, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean that other people can't do part of his job. Right? And that's the famous thing that Rav Kook understood, that Herzl was a spark of Mashiach ben Yosef.
Yeah, but what Rav Kook did just took, exactly, he took the Gra's idea that anybody who's involved in building Zion has a spark of Mashiach ben Yosef.
Right. Okay, we got to go to the break anyway, so thank you so much for your time, and it was very, very interesting, and we hope all the listeners... Okay, take care.
Okay, be well.
We'll be back right after the break, so don't go anywhere.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on The Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. We were so fortunate to hear from Rabbi Ari Kahn, and we were going to discuss a little bit about the Parsha, the Torah portion that we're going through. We just finished the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, and that leads us to the next chapter in Jewish history, which is the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus, and that is really a precursor of all of Jewish history, of our going from Eretz Yisrael into the exile, and then our return from the exile back to Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Lichtman, do you have any comments?
Correct. Yes. But before I actually do it, I mean, one of the questions you asked Rabbi Kahn at the very beginning, that one of the reasons maybe some people don't learn Tanakh is because they don't want to, get the Zionist message. It is so unbelievable because, this is the Torah that God gave the Jewish people. And this is I am a big proponent of Torah Shebaal Peh, of the oral law also. And I learn Gemara every day and Mishnayot and Halacha and all that. And that's all extremely important, maybe even to a certain degree more important because it's the more practical side. But it all starts with the Torah. It all starts with the entire Tanakh, but certainly the Torah. And, one who we've discussed this so many times before, how it's a recurring theme that when somebody who is distanced from Judaism comes back, or someone who is a complete convert to Judaism, these people are always I would say almost 100% of them are more Zionistic or want to live in the land of Israel. And it's such a simple thing to them because it just screams at them when they read the Torah. And, Sefer Bereshit, the entire book of Genesis that we just finished, I mean, there is almost no section that doesn't talk about God's promise to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov about the land of Israel. And it's just through and through. When you come to Shemot, it's also clear in every parsha, maybe not as much as in Genesis, but it is also very clear. And the one that I like to focus on this week's parsha, which is Parshat Shemot, is we really are introduced to the greatest figure in Jewish history in the world, actually, and that is Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is the greatest leader, the greatest prophet, the person who became closest to God. He was really like, God's second-hand man, if you want to say. I mean, our Rebbe, Rav Hershel Schachter, always points out that, the main difference between Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy and the prophecy of all others is that, when he wrote the Torah, it's not like that Moshe wrote the Torah. Other books of Nach, of the Bible, the prophets and the writings, they were written by the prophet in the prophet's own style. And he got an idea from God and he wrote it in his own words. But Moshe wrote it exactly. It was a dictation. God dictated to him exactly word for word, letter for letter, what to say. So much so that, there's the famous question of how could it be that the last 8 verses of the Torah say that Moshe died? If Moshe died, how could it be? Then who wrote the last eight verses? Right? So there's different opinions. We won't get into that. So Moshe Rabbeinu's career starts in this parsha. And I actually want to, though, go to the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's career, at the end of the Torah. And it says there, really, again, as I said, one of the last 8 psukim of the Torah, it says that Moshe died and God buried him in the land of Moab, and no one knows where he's buried till this day. So, Moshe Rabbeinu was a very big lover of Israel, of the land of Israel. He wanted with all his heart and all his soul to go to the land of Israel. So why? Okay, we know why he didn't make it into the land of Israel. But why didn't he at least get the merit like Yaakov we just read in last week's parsha? Yaakov merited to be buried in the land of Israel. Yosef commands his brothers, make sure you take my bones with me to the Eretz Yisrael. But Moshe Rabbeinu is not privileged. This great man, this man greater than anybody else, was not privileged to be buried in the land of Israel. Well, guess what? There's actually, trust me, if you come up with a good question, you know that there's going to be a statement by the rabbis that discussed it. Okay? Somebody already thought of the question. And the rabbis in the Midrash, I think it's in Devarim Rabbah, the rabbis ask this question and say, they compare Yosef and Moshe. They say, Why was it that Moshe was not? Actually, Moshe himself said to God, why Yosef had his bones buried in Israel. Why can't my bones be buried in Israel? And God said to him something very shocking. He said, he who acknowledged his land is buried in his land. And he who did not acknowledge his land is not buried in his land. And what is it referring to? So we know that when Yosef was in prison in Egypt, his master's wife, said about him, Ru'u hivi lanu ish ivri. Look, they brought us an Ivri man, a Hebrew man, to make fun of us. And what did Yosef say? What was Yosef's reaction to that? He said, gunavti me'eretz ha'ivrim. I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. He didn't have to, that was not relevant. Why did he have to mention? And if anything, it would only be to his detriment. And nonetheless, he made sure to mention that he was from the land of Israel. But when it came to Moshe in this week's Parsha, when he saves the daughters of Yitro from the shepherds, so the daughters go back to their father Yitro, Jethro, and they say to him, an Egyptian man saved us from the shepherds. And Moshe heard this and didn't say anything. That's the way the rabbis see it. So because Moshe did not acknowledge that he belonged in Eretz Yisrael, he didn't acknowledge when someone called him an Egyptian man, he didn't right away say, whoa, 1 second, that's not true. For that reason, he wasn't privileged to be buried in the land of Israel. And this is seemingly incomprehensible. I don't understand how could you compare the cases? Yosef actually was born in Israel. Actually wasn't born in Israel. I'm sorry. He was born outside of Israel, but he grew up his whole life in Israel up until the age of 17, until he was taken away and sold by his brothers to Egypt. He lived his life in Israel. So he really was from Gunavti. I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. But Moshe Rabbeinu never saw the land of Israel. Don't forget, he was born in Egypt and spent his whole life in Egypt. So when the daughters said an Egyptian man saved us, why should Moshe be taken to task and be punished for not having said? What should he have said? So listen to this unbelievable idea. There was a great Hasidic rabbi named Meir Yechiel of Ostrovtsa, and he says that the moment that God promised the land to Avram Avinu, every Jew must see himself as a native of Eretz Yisrael. Meaning, it's not enough to just say, I'm a Jew. You have to understand that you belong in Eretz Yisrael. You are an Israeli Jew. And this rabbi, this great rabbi, Rav Meir Yechiel, actually practiced what he preached. In one of his letters, he describes how he responds when asked about his place of origin. If someone says to him, where are you from? So he does not say Ostrovtsa. He says, I am from Eretz Yisrael. I'm from the land of Israel. Except that because of our sins, we were exiled from there, and I find myself in Ostrovtsa. This is how, he writes, this is how everyone should reply when asked about their origins. He should say, I am from the land of Israel, but for the time being, I find myself in a temporary dwelling in the diaspora. And, this message is so strong for us today, our times. There's so many Jews in the diaspora who don't even understand where they belong. They don't even understand where they really come from, where their roots really are. And that is the land of Israel. They think that they're Americans. You ask him where you're from. I'm an American Jew. I'm an American Jew, not a Jewish American, not a Jew who happens to be in America. But that's, again, talking about his Judaism. It's more than that. He should say, I am an Israeli. I'm from Eretz Yisrael. I happen to be in America right now because I have no other choice, because I can't do anything about it, because I'm stuck here. And if people would adopt this type of outlook, then for sure things would change and more Jews would make Aliyah. They would understand. And like we said, read the Tanakh, read the Torah, read the rabbis who lived in Bavel and Babylon. Read what they have to say. You can't say that they were Zionists. They lived in Bavel, and they still taught that we belong in we belong in the land of Israel. Josh, what do you have to?
Yes, well, in defense of Moshe Rabbeinu, not that I'm that he needs my defense, but we know from the Parsha of Eschanon that he davened 515 times to come to Eretz Yisrael. His love for Eretz Yisrael was overflowing, and you shouldn't paint him as someone who was in any way.
Of course, I don't paint him that way. The rabbis do. What they're saying is that someone on his level, a regular person maybe wouldn't get punished for such a small, minor thing, but for someone on his level, he has to understand that. You have to say that you're from Eretz Yisrael. It's not enough to just say that I'm a Jew. If someone calls you an Egyptian, you right away have to scream and say, no, I'm not. I'm an Eretz Yisrael. I'm an
Last thought.
Jew. Yeah.
The Kuzri mentions that Moshe and Aaron and Miriam, their nevuah was in Eretz Yisrael, and they were in the greater borders of Eretz Yisrael, Hashlema, and it could be that he wasn't Zoche, didn't merit to be buried inside of Eretz Yisrael of today, but as the borders expand, he will be there. Thank you so much for joining with us. This was so amazing, and we look forward to hearing from us seeing you next week.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.